Hello, welcome to Scary Thoughts. Horror, philosophy, culture. I'm Mark Cate.
And I'm Chad Lott.
This is episode 115. We're going to be talking about Rick and Morty, Season 7, Episode 10, the episode Fear No Mort.
Very specific.
This one episode from 2023. You can email us at whattthe, WHATTHE, at scarythoughts.org. Do you have anything to plug?
No.
Me neither. Merry Christmas, though.
Woo.
And spoilers ahead. That was an easy intro.
Yeah. And then we may talk a little bit more about the rest of the season as it is.
Yeah.
I don't think you can really spoil a cartoon, but we will spoil this cartoon.
We shall. All right. Where do you want to start with this one?
Well, I mean, maybe how we came to it. We normally do some sort of Christmas episode, which is often late. And then this year, I just wasn't feeling any of the Christmas horror shit. We've already done everything I like.
Yeah.
And you like, presumably. And all the newer horror they just seem like, I mean, this is very weird to be bitching about, but like they seem to be like marketed as Christmas movies. Like they were just put into Christmas just for the sake of having a Christmas horror movie, rather than like Krampus, for example. The whole thing is related to Christmas mythology. Right. Yeah, I just wasn't feeling any of the new Christmas horror.
I'm sure there are some good Christmas horror movies out there this season. I just couldn't find any, which is disappointing. But also, and this is going back to our previous episode, I feel like this has not been the greatest year for horror, at least the kind of horror I like.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like something happened this last year, or the years leading up to it, to the release schedule in 2023, that this was not exactly an exemplary year for the genre of horror.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I think is kind of happening is like, for a minute, horror was this space where like young indie filmmakers could make new interesting movies, like especially when you think about the A24 bent or whatever. And so some of those people obviously went on to like bigger and better things. So, you know, there's the typical horror drain that happens, you know, like very few people like stay in the genre and just keep doing it. Like the dude that did The Witch, I think, is staying in the genre and doing it, and that's his whole deal. But there've been quite a few what reminds me of like late 90s sort of like indie smaller films, especially a lot of like queer film that's been out. Just a lot of like sort of like Oscar bait smaller films that are pretty good. And I think that that's where that sort of like talent pool has moved on to.
Okay, I can see that.
Kind of like post Lady Bird movies.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Post Mumblecore. Like Mumblecore grew up a tad and maybe took a few notes from Wes Anderson or something.
Yeah, like maybe like some of it has like a sort of like a literary fiction vibe a little bit. Like an example would be that film Eileen that just is coming out. It's based on the Tessa Mushfeg novel. So you're starting to get like films based on like
New York Times bestsellers
of like a particular pedigree.
Right.
Yeah.
All right.
So
good for them.
Yeah.
I want some more death though.
Yeah.
But so we have been fans of Rick and Morty, obviously, and we covered that show on previous episodes, and we were a little hesitant with the new season. I felt like it was off to not a great start, not a bad start. It just felt like mediocre level Rick and Morty episodes. There was one that was especially good, but all of them were pretty like okay.
They were all right. And then like the weirdness of the voice changing made you like, is this terrible? Or like, or do I just not like this because it's changed, which is usually my thing. Any slight change I cannot bear.
Yeah.
But I think the season ended up being very good. The last episode in particular was great.
Yes. The season finale, Fear No Mort, episode 10, I think is maybe the best episode of the whole series.
It's definitely up there for me. Like there's Citadel episodes that I love that I think are just phenomenal. I think the entire like the sequence of evil Morty escaping the finite curve, it was so high concept sci-fi that good. I thought it was great. And then this, I think, you know, in the early days of Scary Thoughts, we were really sort of more invested in like specific fears, what they meant, how societal fears manifest as film and pieces of artwork. And this episode is about, you know, specifically, it's like literally about fear and your personal fears or the character's personal fears. And, you know, whether or not it's even useful to work through fear or if you can even actually get over things or like, you know, I think it's kind of funny. the episode mirrors a little bit like my wife and I's argument about therapy sometimes, which is like you go in the hole, you face the fear, you come out and you don't have the fear. And to my thing is like, what if fear has been this thing that has motivated you to be great? Like, what if your like anger has motivated you to be great? Why would you want to get rid of it? Which is my way of dealing with the world, which I don't think is very popular with other people.
Other people in this room.
Yeah. And so like, I was thinking it'd be kind of interesting, you know, like thinking of like the whole as therapist or therapy as a thing. Because of the show, you know, like one of some of the meta commentary about Rick and Morty that I think is really funny is that like, it's a show whose fan base thinks it's Rick, but is actually Jerry. And I think that's sort of true for all people. You know what I mean? You think that you are this badass space cyborg scientist who needs nothing, but you're really probably the saddest person in your family that needs everybody.
Yes, that's fair. Well, it's interesting you bring that up because I think part of what makes this episode interesting is that it does a bit of a sleight of hand about who the protagonist is.
Mm-hmm.
Rick is kind of always the protagonist. Sometimes there are these side adventures that are about other characters. It's called Rick and Morty, but actually the show is mainly about Rick. And it's very interesting that all the most complicated turns in this episode are what Rick is going through and the things that we can potentially identify with the most, which is his story of the death of his wife and how that set him off into becoming the person that he is. This defining moment and him having to confront it is really intense. And I think one of the most interesting things about this episode, but actually that was just fiction. The entire episode was actually about Morty. I mean, it was about his self-perception about his value relative to his grandfather, but it was as if his grandfather was the protagonist and he wasn't.
Yeah. Which is also kind of a weird way of like talking about generational trauma in an interesting way. Like, you know, like Rick's bullshit trickles down to Morty. You know, it's sort of connected, I think is interesting. Like you wouldn't really be able to like separate Morty's fear from what Rick had caused. You know, but and then though, like there's a thing where it's like his wife, I guess she's not real. Diane, the fear hole version of Diane, pretty much like multiple times comments on how much more awesome this version, like Rick C-137, I guess, is still the main character.
Probably.
Yeah. So maybe, depending. This Rick C-137, who is one of only 2 Ricks to have developed portal technology on their own, got that way because of her death.
Yes.
You know, so it's like, again, it's my thing about like trauma making people awesome. You know, it reminds me of the William Burroughs thing where he was like, what's your advice? People, for a while after he shot his wife, people say, what is your advice? He's like, shoot the bitch and write a book. Like this was this really cruel thing where he was basically saying like, have something really terrible happen and then write about it.
Right.
You know,
and that was Cronenberg's primary lens that he seemed to do his film about Naked Lunch through, is this idea of like, you have to kill off your wife in order to manifest yourself.
Yeah.
Charming. So something you just brought up, I have a question about, because, okay, this show exists along multiverses, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when Morty is in the hole, we know afterwards that wasn't actually Rick.
Yeah.
Unless it is a universe in which Rick existed. So there are a couple of options. Morty could just be hallucinating the whole thing, and these are all just holograms, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever kind of model we want to use for fictitious NPCs, an expression that's actually used in the episodes. But especially that Rick is calling everybody an NPC, but he actually is one.
Yeah,
in it.
This is really similar too to like what happens like when they go inside Bird Person's mind, that episode.
I don't remember that.
So like there's like after Bird Person gets like brought back from the Federation and he's in pieces, and then Rick kind of puts him back together.
Yes.
So his mind is shut off, and so Rick goes into his mind to go get him out, and so there's this entire like nested story structure where there's versions of Rick inside Bird Person's mind that Rick has to like kind of partner with.
Yes.
So it like makes me think like, you know, the idea of like parallel multiverses versus nested multiverses, and there's no reason to think that like both wouldn't be happening at the same time in the show.
That's great.
I mean, I don't know if it's great, but
Okay, no, it's okay, but
which brings up like an interesting point to like in the previous parts of the season, Rick Prime has eliminated Diane from all possible universes.
this is what I was getting to.
Yeah, but yet she exists in the universe within the fear hole.
That's what I was going to say. Is if Rick in the fear hole is just a hologram, okay, so's Diane. But is this a portal to a universe that is sort of switched on and off? Because if it is, it begs the question if Diane is also a real Diane in another universe that's being inserted into this whole universe. So it would be a universe in which Diane did actually exist in addition to, so she wasn't completely eliminated from every possible universe.
Yeah, and I don't know if you ever looked at like the Rick and Morty Reddit forum or whatever, or just like the fandom more broadly, is like one of the like the livest questions is what is and isn't canon. And to me, I think it's just boring to even think about. Like, I think the whole universe operates under Roger Rabbit rules, which is it funny?
Yeah, absolutely.
Like, is it funny? Yes. Is it not funny? Then it's not part of the universe.
All right.
And so there's also what I think is kind of funny that the writers of the show and the comic book that's attached to it kind of do. Sometimes they'll tease the audience by like intentionally retconning certain things in really ham-fisted spotlighted ways so that the audience will sort of like do the rest of the work of like retconning all this stuff around. So there's already theories existing about how the fear hole like mechanics work, which I think is kind of funny. And they even comment in it. It reminded me so much of like early Scary Thoughts concerns. Like they're like, what are the rules of the fear hole? Like they can't even get the rules.
I'm staring at a page of notes about exactly that.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, one of my biggest ones is that this is about conquering your greatest fear. So what was all that about? You know, like the story that Rick and thereby Morty goes through is incredibly complicated and multi-layered. So is that just part of the feeding mechanism for the whole demon? Is that just villainous trifling? What's with all these red herrings? It's funny that it starts off, he goes through the hole and this kind of globby thing kind of jumps out at him and almost mocks Morty's scream as a very like, yep, that's what's scary. Something that looks like a ghost comes at you with big teeth. But actually to have Morty confront his biggest fear is this incredibly labyrinthine, elliptical, complicated story that is all red herrings. And so is that necessary? Is that part of the feeding mechanism? Again, following Roger Rabbit rules, it's awesome, but the mechanism is incredibly weird.
Yeah. And that weirdness, I think, is just what makes the show good.
Yep.
Yeah. It's also funny to think about like all the weird little tropes that they mobilize to make it feel more, I mean, like, for example, the hole being covered with like, is it hair? Is it seaweed? Is straight out of Japanese horror.
Yep.
And the fact that they don't really know, but are kind of supposed to be uneasy about it, but like aren't sure if they're supposed to be uneasy. Like that whole sequence when they're kind of discussing it, like how it could work, I think is like so funny and amongst the best writing of the show.
It is. And it makes me feel that something Rick and Morty is doing. Okay, last episode in particular, I was complaining, because that's what I do on this podcast, complaining about how there is all this meta horror. We're in this post-Scream universe now where everything is self-referential. Everything's about the final girl or commenting on the final girl, and the black guy dies first. And all horror has to be self-reflexive or reflecting back onto horror cinema and its tropes. And now doing that is the most tiresome, lazy, hacky trope. It's interesting to watch Rick and Morty almost be one step ahead of that, where they're commenting on the hacky self-reflexive tropes.
Yeah, they even comment on the hackiness of shitting on a Denny's.
Yes.
You know, so I think that sets up the whole idea of like the meta commentary for what's happening in it.
Yes.
But
And when they, at the very beginning, when they first get to the house, they're probably still in the hole. And they're like, hey,
Right.
we're still in the hole.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
And they're honestly like amused by it. They're like riffing with each other about, it's almost as if they were writing it. Okay, we're still in the hole. And here's what's up. And then that would mean this, you know?
Yeah, but which reminds me again, like so many like bangers from the early days of Scary Thoughts. It's like it sort of has like this hypersanity perspective, where they're like ultra aware, and it kind of makes them like if say the characters within the hole at that moment are self aware in their own way, Rick and Morty would appear somewhere in the like territory of being schizophrenic, right? Like they're having like a break with reality that they don't quite understand, but because that's just what they do, you know, nobody really thinks about it that much, but. The whole idea of like the characters being in the universe as self-aware, living their own existences, I think is super interesting.
Absolutely. So this comes on to something that was really interesting to me. I'm afraid that since I have started my degree in counseling psychotherapy, there's a little bit of a turn in the way I approach things because now I'm thinking about psychology more acutely, as you can see from these annoying stacks of books. One thing that really rang out for me thinking about psychotherapy and what happens in this episode is insight. When someone comes in for psychotherapy, what generally happens right up front is they go through an assessment, whether they're assessed by a person who then passes them into the system or onto another therapist, or if you come to me for therapy and I'm kind of assessing you at beginning. And by assessment can be as casual as like, I'm just getting to know you, trying to understand what's going on. You tell me what the issues are, and I start to formulate a sense of like what I think is going on. And part of that assessment is gauging a person's insight. That's a pretty standard, it's not a metric, but it is something that you kind of like, does this person have insight into their problem? Are they lacking insight? Do they know something's wrong, but they don't realize how they contribute to it? Let's just say like someone doesn't understand why they can't hold a relationship down and they are an alcoholic and get blackout drunk every night, but they seem genuinely confused why they can't maintain a romantic relationship.
Haven't met the right woman.
Strangely, sometimes that person does, but that is like exemplary low insight, right? And we all have low insight to some degree. I think that when you go to college, you think you got lots of insight into yourself because, especially if you do what I did and you did, which is get a liberal arts degree, you do a lot of navel gazing. And I think it contributes to a sense that you have a lot of self-awareness and self-insight. And that might be generally true, but we all lack a serious amount of self-insight. We just are not capable of fully understand. The more the better, I feel. And psychotherapy helps a lot in contributing to self-awareness because depending on the approach of the therapist, they can help you look at yourself, hold up a mirror, point out cognitive dissonances, things like that. But ultimately, most people can only go so far. It's just the way it is.
I did no self-reflection in college. Like zero.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I only went to get credentialed for upper middle class career. You know what I mean? Like I was pretty late. I went to college late, you know, so all my existential thinking was done as a bartender, like looking at poverty.
Great.
In the future.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
So, I don't know. But I do think people, I mean, just a personal note, because that's what we do here, I guess.
Totally.
But yeah, I agree. I think people react to those environments exactly like that.
Yeah. So just imagine you feel that something is wrong and you go to therapy. Well, hopefully the process, it's not that the therapist is necessarily going to tell you what your problem is. It's more the process can help you discover whether the therapist comes out and says it because they see it or you get led there. You can potentially see what the issue is and see a path between where you are and where you want to be and how to get there. And I think that this episode sort of does that. They, Morty, but they are in the hole and are constantly asking themselves questions about maybe this is my fear. Maybe this is my fear. Oh, I get it. And they're trying to outsmart the whole, but they're actually trying to outsmart themselves. They're trying to attain a level of insight in order to get out of the hole, which is, again, using that as a metaphor for something like therapy, trying to figure out what's my problem. How do I self-actualize? How do I, quote, get better? How do I get fixed?
Yeah.
You know?
The other thing that's sort of
And they're always wrong.
yeah, but are they always wrong?
No,
though?
they're kind of always right.
Yeah, that's
too,
what
which
I'm
is
saying.
Amazing.
Yeah, it's like these. I was thinking about like every time the whole like would like fake spit them out.
Yeah.
It sort of made me think of like whenever you'd be like, oh, that's the thing I need to do. You know, I need to quit gluten or whatever. You know, yeah, like there's all it's like all these things, and you're just back to where you started before because you're just you. You know,
I thought it was gluten.
Yeah, fuck, I thought it was gluten or like shit. I guess I should get into reggae, like or whatever. You know, whatever dumb shit you do. And it's people really like shit on the midlife crisis, but you know who I think had the best take on the midlife crisis ever was turd boring ass Alan Moore. You know, when he was in his 40s, he decided he's like, instead of getting a Porsche, I'm just going to become a wizard. And he just kind of committed to that bit and started worshiping a Roman snake god and all this shit. And I find it like, I mean, he's just famous and successful, so people tolerate it. You know what I mean? But it is, to me, his take on it is as corny as any polyamorous Ren Fair person's, you know? Like,
sure.
But I do respect taking control of the midlife crisis and like kind of because it is sort of like a reset for a certain period of time in your life.
Completely.
And I think it is useful to get into something, you know, because you got to do, what are you going to do? Just run around and like not really have any sort of meaning in any way? Like you have to make meaning, you know?
It's a completely natural stage transition in your life. And it's when you need to make different decisions. You're a different person now. What are you going to do? Are you going to stay in the previous stage of your life, or are you going to figure out how to move forward? It's like puberty. When you see people go through puberty, it is so uncomfortable because you know they're just flailing about trying to figure shit out. That's what a midlife crisis is as well. It's a person in transition and they're flailing around trying to figure out how to get to the next part. And it's hard.
Yeah. Well, it seems like the puberty is so inflamed by hormones. Do you think the midlife crisis is sort of kicked off by like a drop in testosterone? Do you think that could cause, because when I think midlife crisis, it seems more often discussed in like a man's sort of, you know, like there's like, you don't often hear about like a woman's midlife crisis. Maybe you do. It's like, they sure have them for sure. I'm just gonna say, I don't think they don't have them, you know?
I think it's one of those things that like it first got spoken about in a gendered way and that stuck. It came into popular consciousness with this idea that like it's when a man goes and buys a red sports car because he's losing his hair. And I think that stuck. Instead of thinking about it as a midlife crisis, that when you hit midlife, all your values start to shift. Your purpose in life starts to shift. Your energy goes down. Your wisdom continues to climb. You start to figure out ways that you are able to leverage your wisdom and experience in a way that you don't have to expend as much fucking energy anymore. And you have younger people, most people have families. Younger people are now looking to you for guidance, and you are the person who has guidance. At the same time, yeah, depending on what your hormonal system is, it's starting to make some shifts, and this all conspires to fuck you up a little for some time as you figure out, consciously or unconsciously, where you just were and where you're going.
Yeah. It's interesting how like culture sort of shapes it. Like it's pretty free and open to talk about men's midlife crisis, losing your hair, getting the Porsche, the whole thing, right? Like, and like women, from what I've observed, treat menopause like it's fucking Voldemort. Like they don't even want to hear that word.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, to the point of like angry. But women do talk about Saturn's return, and men do not talk about Saturn's return. And I was thinking about like, you know, if we think about this in the sort of, oh man, what is a really non-angering way to say this? If we think about this in like a Jane Austen way, Saturn's return, late 20s, is when women lose their bloom in Victorian literature.
Right.
And so I'm wondering if like it's just the same thing. It just happens at a different time because of what society sort of dictates.
Yeah, I think it's super complicated. I think that we're also in a time where we're starting to learn how little we know about perimenopause.
Yeah.
While we are, at least I can only talk about the women in my life, are finding that they can talk about it with each other and with me, the bartender, the therapist, in a way that I'm quite confident wasn't as common 10, 20 years ago and will continue to increase. So I think the conversation around women and hormones and transition across later life is really in development right now, at least in the culture.
I think the first time I've even heard it talked about broadly was the Samantha character in Sex and the City. Like Kim Cattrall's character was like, sort of took like the Joe Rogan position on it. I'm like, yeah, these are my creams and everything. I'm like, that character was sort of like the first the first character that was cool openly talking about it. And so men right now have like, everybody's on the juice. You're over 45, you'd be crazy not, like the grandpa in Little Miss Sunshine, like when you were young, you'd be crazy to try it. When you're older, you'd be crazy not to. And I think that's like how people think about like TRT and hormones and stuff like that.
I don't get it.
And I'm starting to not worry because I'm certainly going to join these ranks eventually, but like, this sort of chemically enhanced gerontocracy where you have like muscle tone and wisdom because you can afford it.
That's so funny.
It's like kind of interesting to think
I'm
that
curious.
That might happen.
I think the idea of it has kept me from doing any research into it, but from where I'm sitting, like, this is the best I've ever been in my life. So what do I need hormones for? Like just the thought of it. I mean, I'm not talking about muscle tone. I just sort of mean like hormones do a considerable amount to your cognition and emotional regulation. And I think those two things right now have never been more dependable for me. Okay. And I do not want to fuck with that equation at the moment.
Yeah. Well, you might like not have low testosterone either. You know what I mean? It might not be, despite your political outlooks indicating otherwise.
Can't even argue. I just don't know how to respond. Yep.
The one that I'm the most concerned about is just cognitive decline and just thinking slower. Sure. And that's a thing that for sure happens when you get older. And it seems to be the case that like exogenous testosterone does help with that quite a bit.
Okay,
like
I didn't know that.
If I start to find myself getting like cloudy headed or whatever, I'm for sure shooting TRT right in my dick.
I didn't know that. Yeah. I didn't know those. Okay, interesting.
Yeah, one of the bummers too. It's funny though, like
this is turning into a Joe Rogan episode.
Well, that's
fine. Just a lot of half-baked advice about shit you should put in your body.
Well, I'm not advising anybody else to do it. I mean, with
we're not advising. We're just talking.
No, it's expensive, man. It's super expensive, and then once you're on it, like your body stops producing it, so you're kind of on it forever. Yeah. Which, it's like anybody who has to deal with hormones to treat any condition, like you're now a ward of big pharma.
Yeah. We're all halfway there all the time, anyway. Backing up a little, talking about just horror in general. I feel like this episode, it kicks off about horror in general, right? It begs the question, they're in a fun house and they're not scared.
Right. Like they have the scary thoughts, but they've seen too much.
Yeah.
Like we've seen too much horror. Like there's no fucking way any horror movie ever made could scare me. Yes. Like there's just no way. Yeah. Like I can't even imagine. Like you would probably have to film my wife being killed for real and basically have a snuff film for me to be horrified,
Right. And so here's the question with cinema or just experience in general. Horror movies are a thrill, right? They give you a rush. Maybe there's a jump scare. Maybe there are 20. They can be thoughtful and interesting. Where's the line between an experience, a horror movie, or going in a hole or going on a funhouse ride, between entertainment and catharsis, right? What Morty goes through, you could almost think of a movie doing. Not quite to that degree, but there's some scale where he experiences merely a more exaggerated form of what art can do.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious about this question about like, well, what do you want from horror? Like, people are into horror for so many different reasons, right? You know, we have friends who are into horror for the camp value, but not for the violence. Some people love gore and don't give a shit about camp. You know, we're all into it for different reasons.
Some people use it as a prosthesis for their stunted personality.
Yes, that might be me. But it is the question like, well, how far do you want it to go? And, you know, I draw the line for myself somewhere before a Serbian film, I think, is about where I want a horror movie to go. I wouldn't call what Morty went through entertaining, but it is on the continuum somewhere, right? If movies could be that extreme, if we want to think about Antonin Artaud and a lot of other, like Francis Bacon, artists who were very outspoken about what they think art should be able to do and how art should be able to transform you. Well, what Morty went through is on that continuum. But I don't think any horror movie really has been. Although, I mean, some horror movies have really fucked me up.
Man, I have never had that experience with
I
them
know,
for whatever reason. It's just like, I am, however, like disproportionately affected by like sappy Pollyanna-ish type shit. Like, for example, fucking Ted Lasso. Like, affected me emotionally in the way that I think like, as whatever that emotion is in that direction is as hard as like the person who like has to cover their hands over their face when they're watching Exorcist. You know, like the fucking dart scene in that show, you know, like the famous dart scene. So good.
Yeah.
Or like me, like I personally like super resonated with Roy Kent.
He's
because
amazing.
There's so many parallels in Roy Kent's relationship with Keely and my relationship with my wife. Just even like lines where he like rubbing Keely's feet and he's like, oh, your feet are fucked up. He's like, you're hot, but you're fucked. And that's like my wife. She's a marathon runner. Her feet look like fucking mummy's feet. You know, she's like a 10, but her feet are like a 2. You know, like missing toenails and shit after these marathons. Just horrifying. It's like, man, you don't need a foot rub. You need a fucking farrier or like a blacksmith for this. You know, so that like, that's one thing. Or like, you know, or like the niece, like is very, like my nephew, like, you know, like I'm like just mean and he loves it, you know,
right.
like just little things like, there's just so many little things like that. Or just, you know, the part where they were like, you know, you used to run like you were angry at the grass. Like, that's how I do everything. Or is how I used to be. It was kind of funny. Like I was so inspired by like you being a therapist and that show, and it's all about like talking about feelings. And so a couple of weeks ago, I got like in this mood. I was like, I'm going to be inspired. I'm just going to tell Crystal, my wife, how I feel about certain things. What a mistake. I am never talking about my feelings with a human being ever again. I'm just stuffing them down and turning them into cancer.
Oh, I'm so
it
sad
does
for
not
you.
work like it does in Ted Lasso.
Oh, wow. I'm very sorry.
No.
That's terrible.
Yeah. But, you know, like another thing of that character was like he had used that anger to propel himself to become greater.
Yes.
And it's like, I feel like that's never, outside of like a Rage Against the Machine lyric, Anger's Gift, like it's never talked about anywhere else. I've never met anybody else that shares my perspective that like, not only is it like okay to be angry, it's probably morally justified in most cases. Not most cases, but in most of my cases anyway.
I'm more frequently exposed to this idea. Actually, this comes up especially when working with kids, you know, and you have the emotion wheel and helping kids who are having sort of emotional developmental issues, who've maybe experienced trauma and they end up being very withheld, especially emotionally. And, you know, you assist them in how to locate emotions. And introducing a child to emotions is almost like introducing an alien who doesn't have any and trying to explain them.
Aren't they just emotions that have to be like formed into citizens?
You mean kids?
Yeah.
Not all. But the thing I was thinking of is communicating that none of the emotions are wrong. It's what you do with them. So it's okay to be angry. It's sort of important to teach a child that being angry is okay. What's at issue is what they do with that anger. That you don't hurt another person because you're angry. But being angry is okay. You shouldn't be afraid of it. You shouldn't suppress it. It's okay to develop a relationship with your emotions.
I only have a relationship with that one emotion. But,
I know.
Yeah.
It's mostly amusing for the rest of us.
It is really like a comical level of anger for most people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to go back to, I was talking about how this episode is like a movie and sort of what level, how far do you want to take this? Like, you're into horror? Well, how much? How much horror do you want? Do you want what Morty got? This also got me thinking about psychedelics. When you do psychedelics, and I know you and I have very different relationships to this, almost in the same way we have different relationships to horror, is how far do you actually want to go? I'm definitely someone who I could never wrap my head around why someone would want to do acid at a party. Like, I just don't understand how anybody can think about psychedelics in the context of partying, but I think I'm in the minority. It makes no sense to me. But yet, I can't go that far. It all crumbles.
You mean like just doing LSD in public?
I just mean it all. I can't tolerate altered states. I'm far too attached to full grasp of my cognition. I'm not able to let go at all. I completely lose my shit if I'm not in full faculty control.
I'm reading this book about how gambling machines work and how they generate addictive urges like much more powerfully than other forms of gambling because they were designed to.
Yeah.
And one of the things that the book kind of talks about is that the modern person does not often have the potential to engage in a heroic event. So a heroic event is something where the outcome is not certain. The odds are slightly against you, but you come out on the other side and have an outsized reward. And so it talks about how like gambling, especially the machines, like give you that sort of feeling where you're like, oh, I fucking rolled the dice and I came out on top. And like the threat of losing all your money are like the stakes and make it sort of realistic. And to me, like I've always felt about psychedelics a little bit like that, where it is this thing that gives you a potential to have an adventure, kind of like a heroic experience. And like it's even like written into the culture of it. Like Terrence McKenna talks about the heroic doses of psilocybin, and you know, and it's all tied into like shamanic spirit quests and stuff like that. But that's not really how I rock it.
How do you rock it?
Oh, I just try to get blasted. You know, I'm not trying to heal anything, or you know, I just like the actual experience, like very similar to Summer Sanchez, like when she's upset because people think that she's doing drugs because of some underlying trauma, and she just simply just likes doing drugs.
I don't want to be judged for doing drugs because there's something wrong with me. I just want to do drugs to get high. What does she say?
Something like that.
Huff
she said
paint
something.
or
when she gets caught huffing.
Yeah.
And that's like the big therapy episode.
Yeah.
Isn't that the Pickle Rick episode?
Yes.
Yeah. That might be the best.
It is.
Yeah, I think that's probably the best episode.
It is. Again, I enjoyed framing the experience of the fear hole as what art can do, especially in the horror realm, but it's also easy to think about this as like a guided psychedelic trip.
Oh, totally. I don't really totally know how I feel about psychedelics as a therapeutic methodology, like how it's like sort of like everybody's so into it right now. It's like you're in PTSD. First of all, there's almost no studies.
Ooh, that's not true now.
So I think
in the last couple of years, lots.
You're going to know more about this than I am, but the studies that I had looked at most recently seem kind of weighted to get the results that they sort of want. You know, I don't totally.
I wouldn't argue with that.
Yeah,
yes.
It's a bunch of like psychonauts who have had some success. Like they're not. they're not like great studies the way they're done. They're also very small. There'll be like 6 people involved or something. So as far as like the quality of the studies go, the quality is quite low.
It's going to take some time to bear out what's actually happening.
Yeah, and I think there's like an incredible amount of like previous cultural events to look at, like the 60s. You know what I mean? Like you had an entire generation of people like basically turned on, tuned in, and dropped out or whatever, and they had the best acid, probably with the best environments. Like everybody who was doing it was into like peace and love and hippie shit. You know what I mean? Whereas now it's like, I think it's kind of worse. It's like, oh, you're supposed to go on an acid trip so that you can become a more effective communicator at work. Fuck that. This is terrible.
I do agree with I think what you're describing is there's a thumb on the scale of this research. I don't doubt that for a second. One of just a little thing. I think we brought this up once, but there was one Scary Thoughts episode that never made it to air. We did this episode about recursive horror.
Oh, right, right.
We did this whole episode about time loop horror. I had been working on it for I think 4 years. I put in research and we recorded it, and it was really bad for several reasons. So we just canned it, which is too bad because I still feel like there was a PhD dissertation that I never got to finish.
I had forgotten about that episode.
Yeah. It could have been good. It just wasn't. But that's in this episode.
Yeah, there's definitely that.
They're stuck in the hole and they keep coming in and out of it. And they're like, is this, and Rick says something like, if I'm still doing this in 2 seasons from now.
I'll be very disappointed if there's not a callback in 2 seasons to the fear hole. Like all of a sudden they just come out of it and then they don't talk about it further. Like they just exit it or something like that.
Yeah.
Now that I think about this, probably very inside baseball. So Scary Thoughts listeners who are interested in in the discourse of an unaired Scary Thoughts episode, I think like the idea of recursive horror is great and interesting and like just infinitely discussable, but none of the examples of the films are very good. Like they're not like great films. Like what do you think is the best example outside of Groundhog Day, which is the best example?
Triangle and Edge of Tomorrow. And Edge of Tomorrow isn't even really horror.
Yeah, I agree with those 3 being the best. Only One Room's horror, and it's the worst of the 3. So
I love Triangle. A Triangle's sort of like a Donnie Darko, where it's like it almost feels like it was good on accident.
Yeah, I would agree with that for sure for Donnie Darko. And then there is like that dreaminess that both of those films have. I think there's that. But again, it's like we may as well have just done an episode on the Triangle and like dialed back the high concept a little bit.
We should just do that. It really is one of my favorite movies.
I don't want to watch it again.
Okay, let's not. Jesus. Oh, but one thing, I'm just looking at my notes. It just says recursive horror is annoying. So it's just funny.
See?
Yeah. No, that's exactly like when they're stuck in that loop. It's just like, oh, fuck, this is so annoying. But movies and TV shows like Russian Dolls and stuff like that, when it's happening, there's often this like, oh, this again. That's a Russian Doll for sure. Or Palm Springs, Palm Desert comedy. Anyway, but oftentimes it's like this adventure, but actually it's kind of bullshit if you're fucking stuck in this loop. Okay. So,
yeah.
You who are fearless, smoke so much cannabis, you're more interested in seeing demons than having a good body high.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So I've kind of 2 questions for you if you were to go into this fear hole.
Mm-hmm.
One is, what do you think the hole would distract you with? Like, again, there's this big red herring. There are 2 red herrings.
Because it wants to keep you in there.
Right.
Yeah.
So the main red herring is that it's Rick's story. The kind of sub red herring is that it's about Rick and his dead wife.
Mm-hmm.
But it's actually about Morty confronting his own relevance relative to Rick. So if you were in the hole, what do you think you would be most likely to believe is your biggest fear? And what do you think it actually would be?
Well, I think it would be the same, like, because I'm pretty clear with what it is. It's fucking dying alone in an old folks' home. Like, it's the most terrifying outcome in my life. I've seen it up close a few times. I, like, volunteered in an old folks' home. It is terrifying to me.
So what are you doing to prevent that from happening?
I'm trying to make enough money so that I can just hire a hot nurse to take care of me at home until I die.
And by take care of you, you mean kill you early?
A hand job and then death. That's all I ask for.
All right.
Sweet release from this mortal coil.
All right. That's pretty good. Okay.
That is like hands down, like that is the most motivating thing in my life is to like not die in an old folks home.
Wow.
Like especially a Medicare old folks home. It is so deeply fucked up that like I don't even think people have an awareness of how fucked up it is.
See, what's interesting is I just recently went to one of my closest friends' mom's old folks home, and it was awesome. I was so jealous. This place was beautiful.
Are they of some means?
Yes.
No, so there you go. That's my point.
No, I know. I'm just saying like that it's not necessarily old folks' home equals horror. It's more about what kind of place you end up in.
Oh, like a Medicare old folks home. But even then, like most of them are pretty disturbing. Like Jerry, who you met at our house party recently, the dude I went to high school with.
Yeah.
Okay. So Jerry and I, when we were in Catholic school together, we had to go volunteer at an old folks home. And have I told this story?
Well, you told it to me. I don't know if it was on the episode.
Yeah. Anyway, so we go and we show up at this old folks home. No one there knows that we volunteered there. Nobody working there. So there's these two high school kids now in an old folks home. And they say, here, while you're here, just go give water to everybody in their rooms, you know? So you just go fill out these pitchers. And we're basically like decrepit hospital rooms, like with two people in each one. And they're almost all of them like moaning and screaming and like just, they look terrible. It's like, you know, horrible shit. And Jerry and I, to like complete this task quickly, split up. And then I come out of a room and he comes running out of one of the other rooms. And this is how I remember it. Like I'd be interested to see how he remembers it. But he comes running out of the room. Like, what the fuck happened? I hear screaming in the room. Some woman just yelling like the cat lady in The Simpsons, like, and this woman, he went in and I go in the room and it's just like floor to ceiling, like pictures of the Pope, the little cards that you get when people die, it's like just like cards everywhere. It looks like something from The Exorcist. And she's like, had sat up in her bed and was like, I fucked your mother to Jerry, just like, we started screaming at him. And so he like freaked out and ran out.
Yeah.
And so we're there and it's like every person we're interacting with is like, has like, I think like 90% of the people there had like advanced dementia or something. And it was like a hellish experience. And I've never forgotten it. Yeah. And it's also how my dad died. Like, I mean, it's just like, we've seen, you know, having not had a whole bunch of money growing up in the South, that's how people die, you know?
Yeah. This is an issue our society is just not dealing with. The fact that medical science is more invested in quantity, not quality. Yep. And it's really, really gnarly.
Yeah. And then people don't want the inconvenience of an old person dying around their house, I think. I don't know.
Yes.
Well, what's your biggest fear of being misgendered? I don't know why these are such easy shots. I apologize.
That's okay. That's fine. You know, it's probably actually the same.
Being misgendered.
Damn it. You don't get to have it twice. And why was it funny both times?
Because that's the nature of recursive horror.
No.
It gets funnier every time until it's not funny.
Oh my God. No, dying alone. I think that we're coming to it from two probably quite different angles, but that probably is it. I mean, I think I have a lot more fears than you, you know? Not I think. I know that's just true. I'm not a fearful person, but I don't walk bravely through the world, you know, the way.
I don't know that I do. I just walk through it intolerantly.
I think there's a slight tomato lack of discrepancy. Yeah, I don't know. I think But okay, what would I think it was? That might be the more complicated question. It's
Yeah.
like what could I be made to believe is I'm working on this fear,
Yeah.
and it's actually not.
Before you walk that out, I do want to point out that the monologue that the fear mascot gives about like the best case scenario is you die with the other person at the same time is haunting.
It is
to me. Like
it is.
it's
I
like
rewound it.
Yeah.
When I watched it the first time, I rewound it twice, and when I rewatched it the third time, I rewound it twice.
Yeah.
It's really chilling. Yeah. And maybe because, there it is. Yeah, because I get it, because there I am. Okay.
Yeah.
Wow,
It's dark,
this
man.
is the sad
it's dark
episode.
stuff. Yeah. But I mean,
recorded.
like, and then again, like I find myself more emotionally affected by that sort of thing than horror. Like, like famously, I always talk about how like the second Guardians of the Galaxy movie, like just devastated me because it was about like the death of a stepfather that you weren't totally aware of like how important it was like at the time, and which was like right on schedule to disrupt my happiness.
Right.
Horror is the obvious place to get that stuff, but I think it just creeps in wherever it's going to creep in. I think it's like it just fills a space.
Yeah. Do you have any of your pithy little questions?
What you mean, like the usual, like if you were going to try, like what we would do in the situation to try and game it?
Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
So what? What?
Well, I was thinking about like the decision to maybe stay in the fear hole would be kind of interesting. Like if it was actually Rick's, I can't even remember how the episode ended. Rick jumps in the fear hole at the end, right?
He does not.
He does not. Oh, right. He slaps the picture up.
It replicates where Morty, they leave the bathroom, Morty runs down the hall and runs and jumps in.
Mm-hmm.
The end of the episode is they leave the bathroom, Rick runs down the hall and stops at the edge and looks down, and then he turns around and thumbtacks a photo of Morty that he had in his pocket.
Yeah.
Which is very sweet.
Yeah, it's a very sweet.
To the corkboard.
Yeah.
I think a way to game it would be if you could lead it to get you to confront something that's difficult, like resuscitating your dead wife. And if you could figure out a way that it's not feeding off you enough. It didn't seem to be a straight line with feeding off of Rick and Morty.
Mm-hmm.
I know Rick was a fake, but I wonder if there's a way to have a sympathetic relationship with the parasite.
Well, I mean, think about that, like the fear mascot, the Twilight Zone dude.
The fear demon?
Yeah, the guy in the suit.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like, what is his place? You know what I mean? Like, to annoyingly proselytize this, like, terrible experience. Like, he's an ayahuasca guy.
Right.
You know, like, hey, gotta try the fear hole. Gotta try ayahuasca, bro. Like that. But his picture's not on there. So he didn't go through it. That's another thing. Is like, okay, if this thing has been on Earth, it's a thing, it's been eating. Are there only 2 pictures on the wall because only 2 people got out? Or because only 2 people have gone in there, but the Denny's waiter is aware enough of it to like send them back over there.
Unless other people came out, but they didn't win. They didn't process anything. They didn't come out better. They came out worse.
If people are just so intimidated to even jump in the fear hole, you know, like, well, fuck that.
Yeah. That would be me.
Yeah. I think another funny gag was like when Morty like eats the spider.
It's great.
It's just super funny. There was a spider by house yesterday. I was like, could I even put that in my? I was like, I could eat this spider right now, like without any harm to me. And I was like, I could not make myself eat the spider. I was like, I'm not putting this in my mouth. No fucking way.
That's how I feel about red meat.
What?
It's just not food.
It's the most food.
I know that's why my skin is this color.
You do have that Moby hue.
I totally have that Moby hue. Thank you.
Do you have any more notes?
I had something about Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead. I guess that's just that Rick is the... You know, it's funny. I never thought of it until just now, but Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead is what happens when you take an NPC and give them an actual fully fleshed out narrative and give them a soul. And that is kind of what this episode is a bit about.
A little bit.
Runs alongside that question.
Also makes me think an older Tim Roth would be a decent Rick Sanchez.
Oh, holy shit.
That'd be actually pretty decent casting.
Yeah, we should tell him.
Yeah.
What else have you got?
Timothy Chalamet is Morty in this version, just because of his just
no.
He's annoying.
I just need there to be a movie that has neither Timothy Chalamet nor
Zendaya
or Fred Armisen.
What is he in?
Fred Armisen is in fucking everything. I think he's in 50% of movies that have been released in the last 10 years from Hollywood, especially comedies.
I don't know that I've noticed him in anything that's a movie. Like, I mean,
I wish I had your problem.
Well, he has my two favorite of his characters are the bookstore owners in Portlandia.
That's good.
I think they might be the best characters in Portlandia, but also the Venezuelan character in Parks and Rec. And go to jail, straight to jail. Like
I don't
that
really
character.
remember
Oh
that.
man, he's excellent in that. I also love that, like, the car that Jerry Seinfeld picked for him on his episode of Comedians in Cars and Getting Coffee is like this green 2-stroke Saab. Like, a 2-stroke car is like the weirdest fucking thing
That's great
to have, which I thought was like pretty appropriate. Yeah. So Rick and Morty. Sorry, it's not a horror, but it's horrifying.
That was the most horrifying. That was a pretty upsetting episode.
You think so?
Yeah.
You mean an upsetting episode of this podcast or upsetting episode of the show?
Both. I think most of the best episodes either end on a brutally nihilistic moment or something that's kind of sweet. And this episode ends on both.
Like the first season of True Detective does.
Yeah. Fair. Yeah. It is so dark and so twisted and so despairing, but it's kind of sweet. And also, I do appreciate that even though this is a series and to a certain degree, it sometimes follows Simpsons logic, like they're just in stasis. Because it's a cartoon, they don't have to grow old and they can always be the same age and never grow. This is an episode that indicates that Rick is growing. In all of these very convoluted and complicated ways, Rick growing as an individual is often a question, even if it's even the same Rick. But him having a photo of Morty folded up and in his pocket and him putting it on the cork board is not something that season 1 Rick would have done or had. This is about him learning to appreciate his family, which the whole show kind of is about, right? And it is also interesting that him confronting his fear, even though it wasn't actually him, so many of his fears, especially around his wife, are about him losing his family. It keeps coming back to that. But actually, it's reinforced that his family is important to him at the end.
It's weird, though, like, because, like, the metaphysics of the show are that there's infinite families. So it's weird. It feels like a failing for him to become attached to this single family that he's, like, sort of built.
No. It's sort of the flying in the face of nihilism that you can rationalize yourself out of family, right? What difference does it make that I was born to these people? It's just genetic material. So what, they fucked without protection, blah, blah, blah. And the only reason why they took care of me is because they're genetically engineered to feel responsible for me. That doesn't erase familial bonds. That doesn't erase love. Just because you can rationalize it doesn't mean it's not real. And just because Rick is the smartest, most powerful human in the universe who can outsmart his ability to care about his family doesn't mean he doesn't care about his family. It doesn't mean that as he's getting older and too tired to be an asshole all the time, that he's not really coming to realize what's actually important. And it's not power and dominion. It's spending time with his grandson.
I mean, there's also the potential that it's just of the infinite things he's done, this is just him trying this out.
That's true too.
There's that. And then it'll just be another data point.
That's true.
I'd be curious to, like, I wish I could be like a fly on the wall in the writing room, especially like the post, like Justin Roiland writing sessions where it's like, I wonder if they did a certain thing. I was listening to this interview with Dave Ramsey talk about like how he was like the whole show, right? Like it's the Dave Ramsey show. And now they were like, he's like, well, if I die, everyone's out of a job. So
Right.
they've purposely dialed up these other like side characters.
Groomer.
Yeah, he's a groomer. He's grooming people for financial success. But like, so he has like his daughter and a couple other people now. There's all these different
Some of
personalities.
them are pretty good.
Well, it was interesting, like, you know, as a sort of like marketing type person or a data, a data person, they talked about how in the early days, when they first started doing it, whenever somebody else would host the show, the numbers would just fall through the floor. And now when he's on the show, it's the lowest numbers. Like, so the newer, younger audience like doesn't really respond to him in the way that they respond to the younger people who are more like them. And I'm wondering if like the minimizing of Rick, it feels like this last season, a lot of the family has had more like forward independent things that are happening, and Rick is like less important to the events of it. I wonder if that was like a purposeful thing where they're like, okay, these voices are a little weird. Let's sort of like spread out the narrative amongst all these different characters a little bit more evenly, or even like the world itself is a little bit weirder.
I don't know.
Now that you're over horror, what sort of movies do you think we want to do in 2024?
I'm not over horror. I just want horror to be better. And I don't have the tenacity and the stamina like the Overlook kids have for the sort of DIY ethic and aesthetic. I like my horror movies with a decent budget and well-funded ingenuity. So I'm just hoping that we're in a little bit of a bump in the road and that things will bounce back in the new year. I don't have high hopes. I just wonder if Blumhouse is actually kind of done and A24 is just less focused on horror as a genre, and then all the possible inspirations that could have been taken from that kind of approach to horror that we've had, it might just be dried up.
Yeah, I think something else that I don't think you mentioned is that the moment we're in right now, like traditionally when there are wars, horror movies become less popular, like just dramatically less popular. Like, people rarely talk about it, but the early 2000s downturn in horror quality, it really just tracks with the war on terror. Like once people are able to see people blown up on CNN, it pretty much, you sort of are like lose a little bit of taste for like silly graphic violence, especially now when you can just go on like the wrong Reddit thing and just see Russians and Ukrainians torturing each other.
Yeah.
It's like You're Next doesn't really stand up to that.
Right. For sure. Yeah, we'll see.
Well, hopefully the economy rebounds as horror would with it, and then we'll be rich in horror.
I don't know about horror. I don't know where it's going. This made me feel very optimistic about Rick and Morty, which I was very invested in and then became a little less invested in. And then now I'm all in again. And I'm thankful that this thing I like continues to be a thing I like.
Yeah, I was a little worried that the post Justin Roiland was going to miss a beat a little bit, but it seems to be going more like Iron Maiden, replace the singer, things get cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is like the Ronnie James Dio era of Black Sabbath, of Rick and Morty.
Wait a minute.
Thanks for listening.
Let's just cut this out. I don't even want to look it up.